Aloha, good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. And thank you for joining us. On behalf of Pacific Forum, the University of Tokyo's Center for Advanced Science and Technology, and our event sponsor, the U.S. Embassy Tokyo, I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, The United States and Japan Allied Against Disinformation, number 2, Next Generation Voices Speak. My name is Rob York, Director for Regional Affairs at the Pacific Forum, and your MC and moderator for today's event. Please note that this session features simultaneous interpretation. You may access the English or Japanese channels using the globe icon in the bottom right portion of your screen. For those of you who are not familiar with us, Pacific Forum is a Honolulu-based foreign policy research institute. Through our original research initiatives, cross-cutting publications, public webinars, next-generation initiatives, and Track 2 policy dialogues, Pacific Forum seeks to promote a deeper understanding of the Indo-Pacific's geopolitical and security environment. And today's program is no exception. Pacific Forum, like the U.S. government and much of the international security community, considers the information space a crucial theater in the United States' ongoing great power competition, including with the People's Republic of China and with Russia. To meet the need for fresh policy ideas, as well as Pacific Forum's long-standing mandate of training the next generation of policy professionals in the U.S. and its partners, we present to you this webinar. Today, viewers will meet the finalists of our Young Professionals Essay Contest as part of our ongoing program, The United States and Japan Allied Against Disinformation. Each of them will briefly present on the findings of their research before answering a few questions about the topic and their recommendations. Before our presentations, allow me to briefly introduce our finalists. From the US, we have Jonathan Marek, a project manager at the National Bureau of Asian Research, where he oversees research on Indo-Pacific digital governance, emerging technology, trade, and intellectual property issues. He's a graduate of Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, and his academic interests include the role of economic statecraft and grand strategy, the intersection of technology, trade, and national security, and China's economic and technology ambitions. From Japan, Taro Nishikawa, who is a master's candidate in international affairs at the Hertie School in Berlin, will be the next speaker. He previously served as an officer at the Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces, specializing in military logistics and liaison for more than 4 years. From the US, we next have Rachel E. Brooks, a risk intelligence professional specializing in disinformation and other digital threats to democracy. Rachel is currently a project manager at Microsoft's Democracy Forward initiative and previously served as a private sector intelligence analyst, Fulbright grantee in South Korea, and Rotary International Peace Fellow in England. From Japan, Ryohei Suzuki is a doctoral student at the Graduate School of Law at Hitotsubayashi University. He has published various Japanese translations, including chapters 5 through 7 of Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency, and The Sunnylands, Principles on Enhancing Democratic Partnership in the Indo-Pacific Region. Finally today, presenting, we will have from the US, Thomas Ramage, who is an economic policy analyst at the Korea Economic Institute of America, as well as a Pacific Forum Young Leader from 2021. Our sixth finalist, Kotaka Riichiro of Tohoku University Graduate School of Public Policy, could not make it today, but his essay, like those of our other finalists, will be collected in our soon-to-be-published volume. At the end of today's program, we will announce our first, second, and third prize winners from both countries.
So, as Rob mentioned, I'm Jonathan Marek. I'm a project manager at the National Bureau of Asian Research, and I'm grateful for the opportunity today to present on countering the threat of authoritarian influence platforms, and specifically how the United States and Japan can cooperate on threat analysis and mitigation. So I want to first start by outlining the risk and the kind of the specific disinformation challenge that I seek to address. And it's one that is enabled by the role that digital platforms, and by that I mean social media, messaging apps, other tools that allow users to share information, pose in terms of amplifying the spread of disinformation. The causes of this are numerous. A couple include the fact that these platforms allow for messaging that can both be targeted to specific groups of users as well as can scale, so can go viral. And then this is amplified in the case of authoritarian influenced platforms because both the algorithms that promote content to users, as well as the processes that these platforms have for dealing with information that may be disinformation, are both often black boxes where researchers, outside analysts can't understand the scope of the problem or the magnitude of the threat. So recognizing this, a number of threat actors, most notably China, have developed strategies to go after and exploit these risks. And for this, I draw heavily on two reports. One is one that I co-edited with NBR last year, China's Digital Ambitions, as well as Dave Dorman's seminal work on the Digital China Strategy. And what China essentially seeks to do is to dominate all aspects of the digital ecosystem, including these digital platforms, whether that's through ownership, acquisition, or otherwise influencing the platforms that global audiences use, and then to leverage that dominance to achieve their informational goals or to advance what they call discourse power. And the connection of this to disinformation, they have very helpfully made it. So following a Politburo study session, one of the experts who presented said, what is truth and what is a lie is already unimportant. So they see these platforms as a vector, they want to advance their informational strategy, and they don't care whether the information that they are spreading is factual or is disinformation. And we see that this risk is not just some kind of notional strategy in Chinese Communist Party documents, but that it's actually playing out right now. The obvious example of this is TikTok. You can see a number of videos there that researchers at Meta have identified as being Chinese disinformation and have tied to a specific state-linked Chinese entity. Those are all, or were all up on TikTok until the media asked TikTok about it, at which point they've only belatedly started to take them down. TikTok has identified a number of disinformation campaigns that are going out on its platform from such, dangerous threat actors as Spain, Ireland, Taiwan. Now they have also identified some campaigns originating from Russia and the DPRK, but they haven't identified any from the PRC, even though clearly that content exists. And I think you all are smart enough to figure out what influences might be leading to that situation. But perhaps even more pernicious is what we've seen over WeChat, a Chinese-owned messaging and social media platform, as relates to the ongoing election interference campaign in Canada. So there was a disinformation campaign that went out across this platform targeting a Canadian MP, and a Canadian government report on the matter identified two specific instantiations of the risks I mentioned earlier. One, WeChat didn't give any data on the spread of that campaign. They have been completely opaque about it, so there's no way to know its breadth or its extent. And two, WeChat has, nominally in its terms of service, rules against the spread of disinformation, but they have chosen not to apply those to take down this Chinese-linked disinformation campaign. And again, doesn't take too much mental effort to figure out what influences might be leading them to that decision. So recognizing these risks, I think it's incumbent on all countries, all like-minded partners who view the free and open digital ecosystem as valuable, as worth protecting, to step up. And I think US and Japanese leadership in this space more broadly is really the rationale for why the two countries are ideal partners to cooperate on counter-disinformation efforts. And one tangible measure that I propose is the establishment of a Joint Platforms Analysis Center, a JPAC, to address these risks. What that would do is it would set up a set of criteria related to ownership, potential influence or coercion over employees, and past practices of spreading authoritarian state-linked disinformation to designate platforms of concern. It would then be empowered to research and investigate how disinformation propagates across those platforms and what they do or don't do to combat it. And then from there to provide recommendations both to the platforms, if they genuinely have an interest in countering this disinformation, or to governments on how to address platforms that don't have a genuine interest in preventing the spread of this authoritarian disinformation. I think there are several advantages of a JPAC-based approach. One is that it's universally applicable, so it's not playing, whack-a-mole with individual platforms, but rather it's a coordinated set of rules and policies. Two is it's transparent and evidence-based, so both the United States, Japan, and numerous other like-minded partners are party to digital trade agreements that, for instance, prohibit mandatory source code disclosures. But to really drive down into these platforms as algorithms, you need to look at those. And one way to maintain this kind of general prohibition on this is to leverage the exceptions made in those agreements for investigations related to national security. The JPAC could identify the national security risks, trip those exceptions, and therefore maintain the core digital values while simultaneously conducting its necessary work. And finally, it's not unilateral. The mere fact that it's bilateral pushes back against authoritarian propaganda that this is just some political maneuvering. And I'll get more into how it can be expanded even beyond the US and Japan to conclude. This sounds like a new concept, but really there is a strong precedent for this. It's the Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Center in the UK. So similarly to the JPAC, this targeted an authoritarian influenced digital entity, Huawei. It identified and published tangible cybersecurity risks. So not just, broad concerns, but specifically drilling down into the code powering Huawei products and services to find the risks. And then finally, while it didn't directly issue recommendations, it played a key role in influencing policymakers regarding how to use Huawei. And quickly to wrap up, I did mention earlier, it's important to not just leave this as US-Japan, but also to bring in other like-minded partners where possible. There are numerous ways where this could work well. One is through the G7, which already has a similar mechanism. Another is through the Quad. And then the third is bringing in the ROK. We saw in the Camp David Summit some very strong language on the threat of foreign information manipulation. So I think those are all valuable avenues to explore beyond just US-Japan cooperation. And I look forward to discussing that further. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, very much for that presentation on how these countries can work together in a formal setting. And yes, I would very much be interested in hearing about potential collaboration with other countries during the Q&A. But for now, we will go to our next presenter, and that will be Mr. Taro Nishikawa.
So thank you for your kind introduction, and also thank you for having me today. I'm Taro Nishikawa, a master student in Hardy School. In my essay, Breaking the Information Cocoon, I particularly focused on the recent evolution of the cognitive warfare concept within China's People's Liberation Army, or PLA. Cognitive warfare is a warfighting concept aiming at gaining superiority in human cognition using all national assets. China believes that by influencing the cognition of an adversary's public or its political leaders, they could win wars with minimal cost or even without fighting. In line with this cognitive warfare approach, there's a growing discussion within the PLA around the new type of disinformation campaign. In light of this, my primary question is, what measures should Japan and the US take to effectively tackle this new type of disinformation campaigns? To tackle this question, I started by analyzing the latest discussions within the PLA, where the idea of information cocoon have been frequently cited. Information cocoon, originally coined by American legal scholar Cass Sunstein, describes an information environment where people are surrounded solely by content that matches their preferences. Such kind of information environment could skew their perception into a specific direction. The modern internet landscape has made us vulnerable to these information cocoons. For example, features like recommendations on social media platforms often limit users' exposure to diverse information. Given this circumstance, PLA theorists are exploring a novel disinformation strategy, exploiting the characteristics of information cocoon. In my essay, I've labeled this strategy the personalized disinformation campaign. In this type of disinformation campaigns, the target audiences are segmented into smaller groups based on their attributes such as personality or social status. In this segmentation process, the target's online behaviors such as likes or connections on social media are actively utilized. Following this process, the disinformation senders create contents tailored to the preferences of each segmented target. A key enabler of this content creation phase is the emerging technologies like generative AI or deepfakes. Leveraging these tools, disinformation senders can produce vast volumes of content, distributing it rapidly to each target across multiple channels. Once the target engages with this personalized content, algorithms on the digital platforms begin to prioritize the display of similar content. As this process continues, the target's information cocoons become saturated with disinformation carrying a specific political agenda. This can significantly skew the target's cognitive processes and subsequent decision-making. So what kind of challenges could personalized disinformation campaign pose us, especially for democratic nations like Japan and the US? Let me explain using Japan as an example. Last December, Japan announced a plan to deploy an AI-driven system within the Ministry of Defense. The primary purpose of this system is to monitor and detect disinformation content on the internet. However, this system becomes a target of criticism. One Japanese news agency reported this system is actually aiming at manipulating public opinion. As shown in this case, excessive intervention in the public information space by governments could be regarded as propaganda. On the other hand, if we rely solely on reactive measures like fact-checking, we might diminish the effectiveness of our counter-disinformation policy. Looking at past studies, it was found that false information spread faster and more broadly than the tools. This insight implies that by the time fact-checkers step in, information cocoon may be dominated by personalized disinformation contents, and this situation can significantly diminish the effect of any counter evidence that presented later on. So these examples illustrate how personalized disinformation campaigns can place democratic nations like Japan and the US in a significant dilemma. On one hand, there's a pressing need to adapt preemptive strategies to balance out their disadvantages in outreach. On the other hand, these proactive measures can conflict with democratic principles and paradoxically undermine the legitimacy of counter-disinformation efforts. To tackle this challenge, which countermeasures should Japan and the US adopt? The ideal measures would enhance their proactive approach while ensuring accountability to their population. Bearing this in mind, I would like to put forth two policy recommendations. Firstly, Japan and the US should advocate for multiple rulemaking regarding access to data held by digital platforms, especially data concerning algorithms. This access would enable government to evaluate the potential risks of algorithms being weaponized for disinformation campaigns. Moreover, the data access should be extended to independent agencies like Research Institute. It allows their citizens to consistently monitor government communication activities from neutral position, thus ensuring accountability for counter-disinformation policy. Secondly, Japan and the US must focus on bolstering their bilateral capacity for strategic communication. Although strategic communication has gained prominence in both Japan and the US as a proactive measures to counteract disinformation, there is a noticeable gap in the bilateral approach. Given this situation, Japan and the US should develop a bilateral guideline on strategic communication. Furthermore, they should utilize the bilateral exercise as an opportunity to practice their interoperability on strategic communications. And so these two counter measures complement with each other and ensure us to proactively engage with the threat of personalized disinformation campaign while ensuring accountability to our population. And so thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Taro, for that very detailed presentation. With that, we will now turn the floor to Rachel, who will be our next speaker.
All right. So thank you to the Pacific Forum for hosting the Allied Against Disinformation webinar and the opportunity to speak about information literacy and education's role in pre-bunking disinformation in the US, Japan, and elsewhere today, and opportunities for cooperation to advance these efforts as well. I'd like to start by stating that the views expressed here are my own and don't represent my employer, as well as happy National Voter Registration Day to those in the United States. So my piece's central thesis is that the formalization of anti-disinformation education for young learners is vital to developing the critical thinking skills to curb false information spread online. So as a former educator, I regularly think about how one teacher influences countless students throughout their career, and those students can build on, leverage, and spread those learnings throughout their own lifetimes. Education is a scalable and essential way to help young people around the world navigate their information environments. My essay pinpoints the role of civil society. Specifically, it examines how civil society can best bolster an educational approach to disinformation as an effective preventative measure against the challenge. The fragility of democracy in the US, Japan, and elsewhere stems from some of its greatest strengths, including free speech and public debate. However, those characteristics leave these countries ripe for manipulation from information operations targeting these countries' existing social divides. Disinformation's ability to rapidly transcend countries is reason for concern, especially in global democracies, including the US and Japan. When societies have fractures to exploit, adversaries will almost certainly attempt to exploit them. The Economist cited a new low for worldwide democracies in 2022 as repercussions from the pandemic hampered democratic freedoms. An Economist intelligence unit report uncovered that authoritarian rule accounted for over a third of the global population, whereas 6.4% of the population enjoyed a full democracy. So, situating the US and Japan in this context, we see full democracies are those respecting basic liberties and freedoms with few issues facing how democracy is functioned, and flawed democracies encounter more substantial issues, including low political participation or governance challenges, although they have the basic requirements of civil liberties and free elections. Pew Research Center's reporting classified the US as a flawed democracy and Japan as a full democracy in 2021, although EIU categorized Japan as a flawed democracy in 2019. So we've witnessed collectively the effects of democratic backsliding and shifts in elections or other periods of transition worldwide, and we must remain resilient through information literacy, and it's truly an opportunity for US-Japanese cooperation to advance these efforts. So, there we go. Thinking about technology's role, this education-centered approach presents one strategy likely to support critical thinking skills as students approach false information across their lives. Many children in the US and Japan are growing up with omnipresent social media and messaging applications and navigating online information environments at increasingly early ages. On the screen are just a sampling of the research on major platforms visited and where people in the US and Japan regularly consume information online. So thinking about the role of education here, we want to start early and leverage existing resources. So to implement this approach at the elementary school level, learning outcomes could begin with fundamental concepts such as teaching the importance of values like honesty and the difference between factual information and make-believe or fact and opinion. As students progress into middle and high school, teachers can begin to incorporate more complex lessons to build on those fundamentals. And because disinformation spans subject areas, these lessons could look like an analysis of satirical conspiracy theories in English seminars, real-world examples of past disinformation campaigns in history courses, or viral disinformation in psychology classes. So on the screen are just a handful of existing publicly available educational resources that are ripe for greater incorporation inside of the classroom. So moving on to kind of recognizing the challenges for educators. Earlier this year, New Jersey became the first state in the United States to mandate K-12 information literacy training. And despite progress, we don't want to underestimate the challenges applied to educators to meet learning objectives with finite time and resources. While it may seem obvious teachers would want to bolster their students' critical thinking skills, the reality remains teachers' time is stretched thin as they aim to meet standards with limited resources. Further awareness on the opportunity that anti-disinformation education presents can help educators, students, and organizations alike. So connecting these teachers with free quality lesson plans could help ease those burdens. You can see one case study example on the screen, and there's numerous more available from the research. And education to identify mis and disinformation should be additive across a child's education and become as mainstream as the education to know the signs of a phishing email or other risks. As we start to conclude, inherent in the fight against disinformation is the need to equip the public with tools, trust in institutions, and transparent environments to live up to these responsibilities. Education alone cannot solve the challenge of rampant disinformation, nor should it. The country's government, social media companies, and other institutions must play a significant role in strengthening regulatory frameworks and platform accountability. Education can be a powerful tool in curbing disinformation, particularly when paired with bolstered standards and regulation. Students deserve online information environments that are safe with trustworthy information. And in the absence of such an environment, they need an educational toolkit so they can separate reputable sources and facts from disinformation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel, for that presentation. Now we will move on to our second presenter from Japan, which is Ryohei.
All right, hi, Ryohei. I'm going to share my slide. Okay, hello everyone. I'm Ryohei Suzuki, a doctoral student at Hitotsubashi University. I'm very honored to be invited to this wonderful occasion. So today, I'm going to talk about proposal for countermeasures against disinformation, utilization of the NHK as a public broadcaster. So, generally speaking, it has been recognized that the spread of disinformation in Japan has been relatively suppressed. However, influence operations and disinformation from China and Russia, as well as domestic proliferation of disinformation, have increased concern on this topic. The Japanese government has promoted discussions on disinformation and social media platforms, media literacy, fact-checking, but have avoided implementing robust countermeasures from the perspective of freedom of expressions. Therefore, the voluntary effort of private sectors are respected, and fact-checking activities are the main driver of countermeasures against it. However, according to the study group on platform services, fact-checking activities face some problems related to implementation systems, funding, raising awareness and credibility, and international collaboration. And according to, in addition, in my interviews with two local Okinawa newspapers, the problems below are pointed out. So as a means of overcoming many of these challenges, I propose the use of NHK. As a brief explanation, NHK is public broadcaster established under the Broadcasting Act of 1950 and operated on the basis of subscription fees from Japanese public. And recently, there has been a heavy emphasis on internet internet information dissemination with the stated goal of strengthening reporting against fake news. However, NHK's commitment to fact-checking is not high yet. So, NHK has the potential to conduct fact-checking activities. First, NHK has large financial and human resources. And second, in terms of recognition and credibility, NHK is most trusted media source of information. And third, NHK is a member of Trusted News Initiative, an international media network dedicated to combating disinformation. Because of these strengths, NHK has the potential to overcome the challenges of fact-checking activities. On the other hand, due to the existence of various scandals and the impression that NHK is pro-regime, its direct implementation of fact-checking may be perceived negatively. So I propose a more indirect alternative. So my second plan is to utilize NHK's two research institutes. For example, the NHK Science and Technology Research Laboratories can be used for debunking of disinformation before the election. This laboratory conducts research in natural language processing and image and sound analysis. Utilizing this feature to analyze the disinformation spread in past elections and making it available to the public and mass media would lead to debunking of disinformation and data accumulation. In addition, after the elections, the NHK Broadcasting Culture Research Institute can be utilized to conduct a fact-finding survey of disinformation. The institute not only analyzes the media, but also conducts and publishes public opinion polls. Using these functions, it is possible to investigate what kind of people are influenced by disinformation and how it changes their thinking and voting behavior. So as a conclusion, NHK has the resources and capacity to do direct fact-checking, but maybe may receive a negative response. In that case, a third-party oversight would be necessary at the minimum. For this reason, this presentation recommended another option to indirectly back up the fact check as a second plan. People may find this option more moderate and acceptable. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Now, for our final presenter of the day, we have from the United States, Thomas.
Hello, everyone. I'll just go ahead and share my screen. All right. Let me get that in presentation mode. All right. So my name is Tom Ramage. I'm with the Korea Economic Institute of America. I wanted to thank the Pacific Forum for hosting all of this, and thank you to all of the guests for attending this morning or this evening or this afternoon. So I'll be going through some of the roots of disinformation and try to sum it up with solutions and how it affects our society. So the roots of disinformation may be as old as political warfare itself, but we really see it become weaponized as a studied craft by the Soviets throughout much of the Cold War. And under the Soviet Union, this was known as active measures. And so the goal of disinformation, which was the deliberate planting of information that is false, was to demoralize, destabilize, create crisis, and then after crisis, bring about normalization. So you see this many times with interventions in different countries around the world, and many of the tactics used back then are some of the same tactics that are used today. For anyone interested in this, I recommend the documentary Hyper Normalization, where this term hypernormalization was coined by Alexei Yurchak. So the purpose of this disinformation, at least in the sense that I'm talking about it, was really to capitalize on outrage within society, to polarize two camps as much as possible, to create as much conflict as possible. This is the goal, to kind of create the divide and conquer scenario. You see this today with foreign actors funding two extremes of political spectrum. You'll see it in the Ukraine war, and you additionally see it with Chinese interventions in Taiwan. So the Hegelian dialectic basically seeks to have a thesis opposed by an antithesis, and with disinformation, plant ideas into both sides so that you can drive your own synthesis of the two, which is your desired outcome. So politically, you may see this as funding one candidate versus another, or funding radical groups on either side of the political spectrum. Another documentary I would recommend that relates to this is The Social Dilemma, which brings up this chart I'm showing here, that we are now more politically polarized more than maybe any other time in US history since the Civil War. Here in 2003 was the more or less political spectrum of the average American, and there it was in 2017. I can only imagine what it would be today, but I bring this up because during the 2016 election, one of the tactics of disinformation was to plant outrageous stories that appeal to different radical political groups in an attempt to shift the Overton window of the United States, which is to drive it left or right, and whatever outcome benefits the party fueling this disinformation, which is another thing I would recommend looking into. So we know some of the actors that were doing this. One of them was undoubtedly the Internet Research Agency in Russia, which was responsible for troll posts on the internet, Facebook, a lot of bot accounts. We probably don't know about other institutes that may not even have names, or that we just don't know about. So one of the ways that the US and Japan can partner against this is to share intelligence relating to the different institutions abroad that might be funding troll armies, bot accounts, or ostensibly leaking information to the press. And we can see how this is affecting our society. So while we may seem to be at peace, we are very much in psychological warfare between great powers. In the era of great power competition, our open societies are used as a double-edged sword against us. Where we have free, open democracy and freedom of press, this is used against us by foreign actors. On the right are some examples of disinformation, where on the bottom left, we see a verifiably Russian-funded fake Facebook group driving for Texas secession from the United States to kind of foment outrage. And on the right, we have an example of an AI deep fake. Now, the dangers to combating this is, on the one hand, you don't want to shift too far to the extreme where we only rely on experts and we create a sort of Twitterati class where we only get our opinions from them. The news should not be there to tell us what to believe, but it should be there to tell us what the facts are. But on the other hand, one of the reasons we're in this crisis now is because we don't trust experts anymore, and our news is less digested. The 24-hour news cycle, which has come about in the last 20 to 30 years, has been a huge driver of this, where they are hungry to pick up the latest story, and there's not a lot of time to process or digest it. So what do? The first is we educate people about the dangers of disinformation. We flag it. We let people understand what it is. Next, we seek answers to questions that come from new technologies. With artificial intelligence, there are questions: who should have the license to access advanced software which produces deep fakes of people? If you're a politician or a celebrity and you're a public figure, does that mean anybody with an AI account has the right to recreate your image in your likeness? Or should this be a privilege given to identified parties? At the same time, you still need to support the freedom of speech. Now, the ways a US-Japan partnership can counter disinformation is they can implement some of these questions into the broader bilateral dialogues. Now, the United States and the European Union became engaged in a Trade and Technology Council. I would recommend incorporating a TTC into US-Japan relations, or broader in the region, US-Korea-Japan TTC, to create a forum for discussing these issues. Similarly, agreements such as the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, can incorporate some of the disinformation countering procedures into one of its pillars. This can include sharing network intrusion alerts, incorporating licensing standards for anybody in the agreement, flagging disinformation. And lastly, I think there should be a return to embracing experts, digesting information as it comes out. People used to sit down with the newspaper, believe it or not, and trust the experts to kind of process the information for them. In the day of Twitter and internet image sharing boards, anything that comes up that grabs the attention of the viewer will be the thing propelled to the top of the page. So we need to embrace experts again. And one of the ways that can do this, is leaving it to the news organizations and amplifying institutions. And I have shown here that branding state media and state-backed media is another great way to do this. So that is all from me. And thank you very much for letting me present today.
Right. Thanks to each of you for your presentations. Please give yourselves a hand, and the fellow panelists as well. Thank you very much. With that, I will have a few questions for each of you. And I want to start with Jonathan. You talk about JPAC, and I wanted to ask you, who should the JPAC consist of? What kind of individuals are we looking for a committee like this? And regarding other countries conceivably joining, what would be the criteria for them joining?
Thanks. I think those are both really important questions. As to the membership and the makeup, I think it will necessarily be a combination of technical experts, so people who can drill down into the data and analyze the spread of disinformation campaigns. I think you'll also need some experts on the various threat actors, and speaking specifically from my experience, focused primarily on China, you'll need people who will both understand the CCP's overall digital and informational strategy, as well as the specific entities within the PRC that propagate this disinformation. So I think it's going to be a wide interagency group. I think there's also a role for the private sector to play. So whether that's threat analysts, external researchers, or even some like-minded platforms that do have a demonstrated commitment to countering disinformation, I think there could be a role for them to play, again, because they just have a unique set of experience. As for additional members, I think the three groupings that I outlined before are a reasonable start. I think the rapid response mechanism that the G7 has set up has led to some really strong information sharing. And so it would be more just about taking it a step further to not just information sharing, but to more active collaboration on investigations as well as recommendations. But I think there are a number of countries outside of those frameworks, particularly in Europe, who could also find a role to play, especially, again, I know I focus primarily on the PRC, but also in reference to Russian disinformation. A lot of countries in Eastern Europe have been dealing with that and have, forgotten more than the US has ever known about the kind of objectives and priorities of Russian strategy in this space.
Right. Thank you very much. All right. Okay. My next question is for Taro. Since you have a question or you have a recommendation about rulemaking, I wanted to ask you, should the United States and Japan be collaborating on rulemaking in this sector? And should their rules for countering disinformation be similar?
Yes, first about what is to be promoted between the US and Japan, well, that's one. But US and Japan can play a central role to come up with international or multilateral rulemaking, working together with other actors. So it's not just the US and Japan, but other actors need to be involved. More specifically, EU last year, I think it's last year, EU Digital Service Act was passed last year. And this is directly to do with the algorithm-based data to be regulated as I proposed. So this act was passed last year in the EU. So in terms of the role of the US and Japan, we can probably deploy this kind of similar thing in Asia Pacific. Quad, 4 countries can cover the majority of the internet users. Therefore, Japan and the US can play a central role to expand such initiative to Quad countries. And EU initiative and Asia Pacific initiative can be combined in the future so that eventually we can create some kind of global standard centering around the US and Japan initiative.
Okay. Our next question goes to Rachel. In what courses could you see digital literacy education being implemented at the elementary, middle, and high school levels? As the parent of a 9th grader, I'm very curious to hear like where this would be implemented. And furthermore, do you think there's the potential for such things to be controversial?
Absolutely. Thank you, Rob. Those are both great questions that I've been thinking about a lot. So on the first one, I think I'll leave it up to kind of the educators with their expertise, but I can see it in a lot of different classrooms, right? We can see, stories from kind of literature in an English classroom, stories about psychology and just the psychology of disinformation and how it kind of gains virality in sort of different psychology classes. History, we see examples from past wars and just disinformation campaigns leveraged internationally as well. So I think there's a lot of examples there. And then kind of, as I talked about in my speech, a little bit of like starting, early with some of those just fundamentals of fact versus opinion, some of those basic concepts and kind of having it build on itself, right? These information literacy isn't going to be taught kind of in an afternoon. It has to have that sort of additive effect over time. So I think kind of whole of education approach would be really promising. And I'm excited about the progress in New Jersey and what some different countries are doing in this space. If we look at sort of like Finland and Estonia, a lot of them are sort of implementing similar sort of information literacy in K-12. So I think we could look to them for examples of best practices, depending on the kind of context within the US and Japan. And to your second question, I think there's absolutely the chance for this to be politicized. I was excited that the legislation in New Jersey had bipartisan support, but I think we're seeing that, the topic of mis and disinformation, just having some of that different aspects. So I think an apolitical, nonpartisan sort of approach is vital to kind of making it effective and having it in sort of K through 12 curriculum, because we have seen some of that controversy with other sort of educational proposals, and we would absolutely want to avoid that. And I think by sort of just putting factual, timely, clear, accessible information at the forefront, hopefully we can all kind of come together and kind of lead with this sort of education that's best for everyone.
Very good. Thank you. All right. And the next question goes to Yohei. All right. As one of the comments in the chat box said, there is at times been a problem with NHK's reporting in this case. So do you think NHK has the public trust necessary for a mission like the one you have discussed? And if not, what could it do to earn that public trust?
Well, thank you for your question. At first, I want to answer the question in Q&A box. Thank you for this comment. I am aware of it, and in fact, I mentioned the Gunkanjima, Midori Nakishimu's accident. And on the other hand, the issue of accuracy in reporting is not limited to NHK. That is why I think it is important to establish a monitoring system by a third party. And the idea is that the NHK with its various resources could expand its fact-checking activities. And about your question, Love, actually, I I myself don't take like investigation of it, so I cannot. I don't actually know about what kind of like emotion the Japanese people have, but at least some journalism institution say NHK is the trusted media, and it is not only Japanese institution. For example, Reuters Institute. In its report, it is mentioned that the trust for NHK is so high, and so I think it's so like subjective truth. I think, but if it is, if NHK should have the way to have more like trustness, I think it's so like critical question. So hard to answer it. But for example, and making more like transparency, or as I said, like making third party monitoring system is important to like make more like trustness, I think. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. All right. And next question goes to Thomas. Looking over the strategy for spreading disinformation, not only from, say, the People's Republic of China, but also Russia, would you say that polarization is the goal rather than shifting support to any particular political faction? And second part of this question, is this strategy new?
I'll answer the second question first. I don't think this strategy is new. I think this is at least a century old, if not centuries old, way of dividing and conquering and increasing polarization. Now, seeding information to benefit one political party or another, I think there are definitely other goals and aims of disinformation. For example, in the context of warfare, leaking the enemy's plans before they can do it is one massive context or way of performing disinformation, or entirely falsifying where the plans are going to go. We saw this in World War II, actually, where the British would paratroop false leaflets detailing the invasion plans for which beach they would choose before the Omaha landings to confuse the enemy. So it is not just to benefit a political party, and it has many dangerous facets, some of which we probably can't even imagine yet. So still very early on all of this. Thank you.
Okay, since we have a little bit of time left over, I have one question for everyone. And this time I think I will go, well, let's start with you, Thomas. If you were a dictator for one day, what is the first thing you would do to counter disinformation in your country?
Well, that is a difficult question because we do not aim to achieve an outcome that a dictator would want to have. But dictators do have incredible control over the media. And oftentimes in countries with dictators, there is state media, which to some extent have a greater degree of resilience to disinformation because the government directly controls what is presented to the public. Now, I think the first thing that I would do in that situation would probably be to just identify all of the foreign-funded media in the country, and verify where they're getting their information from and who might be funding them. I think just increasing transparency would be the best thing if I had all the powers. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Same question for Jonathan.
Yeah, I think Thomas has certainly hit the nail on the head first in saying that one of the key elements is respect for the rule of law and clear evidence-based procedures. So, coming in one day and just taking a decisive action, for instance, a lot of people have said, oh, ban TikTok, which I think, TikTok should not be able to operate in the way it does. I think it is a dangerous vector for disinformation. But again, I don't want us to get into a situation where we're playing whack-a-mole with various platforms. So what I think I would do if I could do something for one day, which is something that is relevant not only to disinformation and to the informational space, but to so many other aspects of the digital ecosystem in the US, is passing some form of comprehensive data privacy and data protection law that would kind of require additional transparency from digital platforms, which is the part that would get at the kind of the disinformation risk there, but also have a number of other benefits as it relates to digital trade, data governance, international cooperation. I know so many US allies and partners just pull their hair out constantly because they can't engage with the network of overlapping state rules and the lack of kind of a federal data or digital authority that they can go to. So if I could get one thing done, whether that's as a dictator or just hopefully, Congress will one day wake up and realize that they need to do their job on this, it would certainly be to put in some framework for data governance here in the US.
All right. Feel free to substitute broad political mandate for a dictator. Next, let's go to Rachel.
Absolutely. I am a big proponent of democracy, so I don't foresee this happening in the dictatorship context. But yeah, I think given this sort of scenario, I would kind of try to take a strategic approach before implementing any changes and kind of see what the current landscape is and just kind of echo what Thomas says about transparency and figuring out the role of media and going from there.
All right. Okay. Ryohei?
Thank you for your wonderful question. If I were to become a dictator, it's just short answer, but I would forbid the free press and increase surveillance, and I would use intelligence authorities to remove inconvenient information on SNS.
Okay. All right. And in conclusion, Taro?
Thank you for your question. So if I am to become a dictator for one day, well, basically, as I said, these two policies, recommendations, especially the one on the algorithm, the data on algorithm, the government and the third party will control such data with transparency. I will create such environment. That way, we can avoid any interference from foreign bodies.
All right. Thanks to each of our panelists, each of our finalists for their contributions, for their presentations today, and for answering my questions as best as they could. Now, with that, I'm going to take the time to, announce the winners. To make this selection, I have relied upon an independent committee's assessment and chosen our finalists through their advice. We will begin with our Japanese panelists. Our third place finalist from Japan authored his paper on the emerging issue of generative AI. He offers a range of solutions for dealing with the news and this very serious problem, especially for the Japanese government. Our third place finalist is Yuichiro Kotaka, who, as noted, could not be here today, but he will be published in our edited volume and receive $250. Our second place finalist received high marks for doing original research and data collection, as well as offering a unique solution to the problem of disinformation and fake news, and that is using Japan's public broadcaster. Our second place finalist is Ryohei Suzuki, and he wins $500 in addition to his publication in our final volume. The consensus pick for first place on the Japanese side was chosen for addressing the current discourse within China and subsequently looking for policy recommendations, paying close attention to PLA tactics, and offering a good focus on a collective Japan-US response. Our first place winner receiving our $750 prize is Taro Nishikawa. Congratulations to you and your fellow finalists. Now, on to the US side. We had a very deep pool to choose from here, and each of our finalists brings a great deal to the table. And I've had to rely very heavily on the assessment of this independent committee that I've asked for their choices. So for our third place finalists from the US, reviewers highlighted the good focus on the nature of the threat in specific terms, as well as the specific suggestions and good understanding of current policies. The third place finalist and winner of $250 is Jonathan Merritt. Our second place finalist was praised for having a strong background and historical analysis, as well as a strong focus on US-Japan collaboration, good analysis of the current problem, and understanding of current policies. Our second place finalist, winner of $500, is Thomas Ramage. The majority view of the committee was that our first place finalist stood out for her writing, for her analysis of the threat, for her good understanding of the literature, and most uniquely for offering personal examples and an educator's solution. Our first place winner of $750 and a place in our anthology, is Rachel Brooks. I want to thank each of our speakers and our panelists today for these great presentations and for taking time to share their insights with us. Please give them a hand. Again, please watch for the complete edited volume from our speakers in Issues and Insights very shortly. Also, we would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes following this event to fill out a post-event survey. Please see the link being shared in the chat box now. I want to again thank our partners at the University of Tokyo's Center for Advanced Science and Technology, as well as our sponsors at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo. Thanks everybody who participated today and who took part in this contest. Thank you, stay well and stay safe.